My father kicked me out for almost burning down our house with my invention. Now NASA is funding my next creation. Growing up in the rural outskirts of Titusville, Florida, I had a front row seat to humanity's greatest achievements without ever feeling like I belonged to that world. Our family's fish farm was just close enough to Cape Canaveral that we could see the rocket launches illuminating the sky, but far enough that my parents considered NASA and those fancy aerospace companies to be part of some alternate reality that had nothing to do with us. That never stopped me from dreaming, though. While my dad spent his days managing tilapia ponds and my mom handled the books for our modest business, I was building model rockets. Started with those basic Estes kits when I was 8, but by the time I hit my teens, those store-bought toys couldn't satisfy my curiosity anymore. You know how some kids collect baseball cards or obsess over video games. I collected rocket specs and obsessed over propellant formulas. My bedroom walls weren't covered with posters of bands or sports heroes. They displayed technical diagrams of Saturn V, the Space Shuttle, and later, the Falcon 9. My heroes were Wernher von Braun, Elon Musk, and Jeff Bezos, men who turned science fiction into reality through sheer force of will and engineering brilliance. My parents humored me at first. Just a phase. They'd tell relatives when I talked nonstop about specific impulse and thrust-to-weight ratios at family gatherings. But as the years passed and my rockets got bigger and more complex, their patience wore thin. "Zach, why can't you just focus on something practical?" My dad would ask after I'd spent another weekend inside, running simulations on my secondhand laptop, instead of helping at the farm. "This rocket stuff won't put food on the table." He didn't understand that I wasn't playing. I was preparing. By 17, I was deep into online forums where amateur rock enthusiasts shared designs and theories. Some of these people worked at JPL or SpaceX and moonlighted on these forums, dropping knowledge bombs that I soaked up like a sponge. That's where I learned about advanced model rocketry concepts and started experimenting with more sophisticated designs that could fly higher and longer than my earlier projects. Looking back, I should have been more careful. Should have started smaller. Should have respected the science more. But when you're 17 and convinced you're destined for greatness, caution feels like cowardice. My latest creation stood 2 feet tall with an aluminum casing I machined in metal shot glass and fins I'd carefully crafted for optimal stability. I'd worked on this design for months. Try to create something that would really impress, something that would fly higher and more impressively than anything I'd built before. My calculations suggested it would reach nearly 3,000 feet, high enough that I'd need FAA clearance if I was following the rules. I wasn't following the rules. The day everything changed was unusually hot for April. The air hung heavy with humidity, and the mosquitoes were out in full force as I set up my launch pad behind our property, near the edge of the drainage pond. Dad and Mom were in town delivering an order, and my younger sister was at a friend's house. Perfect timing for an unsupervised test. Setting up the launch system, I felt that familiar mix of nervousness and excitement that comes with testing something new. My hands trembled slightly as I connected the wires to the battery. T-minus 10, 9, 8, I whispered to myself, thumb hovering over the ignition button on the remote control. This was the moment I lived for, that perfect pause before physics and chemistry took over, when potential energy was about to become kinetic, when dreams were about to become reality. 3, 2, 1, ignition. The button clicked. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, everything went wrong. Instead of shooting skyward in a controlled launch, my rocket malfunctioned catastrophically. There was a loud bang, and my creation failed in spectacular fashion. A bright flash erupted where my beautiful rocket had stood, and debris, pieces of my dreams, scattered in every direction. I stumbled backward, ears ringing and eyes stinging. When my vision cleared, I saw a small flame spreading across the dry grass toward our wooden tool shed. The shed where Dad kept the expensive aerators for the fish ponds and all his irreplaceable equipment. Panic gave me superhuman speed. I sprinted to the garden hose, dragging it as far as it would reach, and managed to douse the flames before they reached the shed. But the damage was already done. The ground was scorched where my launch pad had been. The nearby fence was damaged, and a piece of my rocket had hit the side of our garage with enough force to leave a noticeable mark. As I stood there, Soaking wet and covered in soot, I heard the crunch of tires on our gravel driveway. My stomach dropped to my feet as I recognized the sound of Dad's pickup truck. The next few minutes played out like a nightmare in slow motion. Dad's face as he surveyed the scorched earth and damaged garage. Mom's quiet gasp when she saw the small scratch on my forehead I hadn't even noticed. The terrible silence as Dad picked up a twisted piece of metal, recognizing it as part of my rocket. "What were you thinking?" His voice was firm, controlled, but trembling with an emotion I'd never heard before. "You could have damaged everything we worked for. You could have hurt yourself." I tried to explain about my design, how I must have made a miscalculation somewhere, how it was just a simple error that could be fixed next time. That's when he lost it. "Next time? Next time? There won't be a next time, Zach. I've put up with this hobby because I thought you'd grow out of it. But this isn't a hobby anymore. It's an obsession that's putting our livelihood at risk." Mom tried to intervene, suggesting we all calm down and talk after dinner, but Dad was beyond reasoning. He pointed to the garage, where debris had hit the wall just a few feet from where we stored valuable equipment. "Do you understand what could have happened? We could have lost everything. Because you couldn't follow rules. Because you had to push limits. Because rockets are more important to you than this family's safety." His next words hit harder than the failed launch. "I can't do this anymore. I can't wait around for you to damage our home, or worse. If rockets mean so much to you, then go chase that dream somewhere else. Not under my roof." Mom gasped. "John, you don't mean—" "I do mean it. He's 17, old enough to make adult decisions about these dangerous experiments. Then he's old enough to face adult consequences." I stood there, stunned, as Dad stormed into the house. Mom followed, giving me a look of helpless apology. Through the screen door, I could hear them arguing, Mom's pleas for reason met with Dad's immovable anger. An hour later, I had stuffed 2 backpacks with everything I could fit. One held my laptop, notebooks filled with designs and calculations, and my few personal belongings. The other contained what remained of my hobby materials. Not from today's failed experiment, but the other models and parts I'd been collecting. Mom slipped me all the cash from her purse, just over $200, and a hurried kiss on the cheek. "He'll calm down," she whispered. "Give him a week. Go to Uncle Pete's in Orlando. I'll call him to expect you." But I knew better. I'd seen the look in Dad's eyes. This wasn't a cooling-off period. This was a fork in the road of my life. Down one path lay reconciliation, fish farming, and a practical future in Titusville. Down the other, uncertainty, struggle, but maybe, just maybe, the stars. As I walked down our long driveway, backpacks heavy on my shoulders, and the acrid smell from the failed launch still clinging to my clothes, I didn't know where I would sleep that night. I didn't know how I would eat next week once Mom's cash ran out. I didn't know if I would ever set foot on our property again. The only thing I knew for certain was that I wasn't going to Uncle Pete's. I wasn't going to anyone who would try to talk me out of my dreams or send me back home with my tail between my legs. With the last of the day's light fading and the first stars appearing overhead, I stuck out my thumb at the highway junction. Cape Canaveral glowed on the horizon, and somewhere in that glow was my future. I just had to figure out how to get there without another explosion along the way. The first night after leaving home was probably the longest of my life. With nowhere specific to go, I ended up at a 24-hour McDonald's near the highway, nursing a large coffee until sunrise just to stay in the air conditioning. Florida nights in April aren't exactly cold, but they're not comfortable for outdoor sleeping either. When morning came, I started calling friends, try not to sound desperate. Most offered sympathetic words, but not much else. Their parents wouldn't be cool with some random kid crashing indefinitely, especially one who'd just been kicked out for nearly destroying his family's property. By midday, I was starting to panic. The novelty of freedom was quickly wearing off, replaced by the harsh reality of having nowhere to sleep and limited funds. That's when I remembered Carlos. Carlos Mendez wasn't exactly a close friend, more like a mechanical genius I occasionally talked to in shop class. His family ran Mendez Marine Repair on the industrial side of town, fixing everything from jet skis to commercial fishing boats. Carlos and I had bonded over our shared love of engineering, though it was much more practical than my theoretical rocket obsession. With nothing to lose, I gave him a call. To my surprise, he actually picked up. "Let me get this straight," Carlos said after I explained my situation. "You blew up your backyard, and now you need a place to crash?" I could hear the amusement in his voice, but also a hint of respect. In certain circles, spectacularly failing at something ambitious earns you more credibility than never trying at all. 2 hours later, I was standing in front of a corrugated metal building behind the main Mendez Marine workshop. It wasn't pretty. Faded blue paint peeling in the Florida sun, a few rust spots around a roof line, and a door that screeched like a banshee when Carlos pulled open. It's the old storage shed. We don't use it much anymore except for overflow inventory and junk we might need someday. He gestured to shelves lined with boat parts, cans of marine paint, and boxes labeled only with years. "Dad won't mind if you stay here a while, but you gotta help out around the shop when needed. And no rockets," he added firmly. "At least nothing that could burn the place down." It wasn't much, but to me it was perfect. A concrete floor, electricity, even spotty Wi-Fi from the main building. Carlos helped me clear a corner where I could set up the old futon his family had been storing there. He even returned with a small mini fridge his older brother had used in college. "What will you tell your parents?" I asked as we finished setting up my new living space. Carlos shrugged. "The truth. Dad's pretty chill, and Mom's always wanted more kids anyway. Just don't make me regret this. Rocket boy." That night, lying on a musty futon surrounded by boxes of boat propellers and the faint smell of fiberglass resin, I felt something unexpected. Hope. Sure, I was essentially homeless, living in a glorified shed, but I also had space, independence, and most importantly, a workshop with tools. While Carlos's dad had vetoed actual rocket building, he hadn't said anything about designs and theory. The next few weeks fell into a routine. I'd wake up early, before the main shop opened, and shower in the employee bathroom. During the day, I'd help around the marine repair business, mostly cleaning, organizing inventory, and occasionally assisting with simple repairs where an extra pair of hands was needed. Carlos's dad paid me under the table. Not much, but enough to keep my phone on and my stomach full of cheap fast food. Nights and weekends were mine, though, and that's when I really got to work. Without the distraction of school, I decided to finish my senior year through online classes. I could focus entirely on my passion. One night, after spending hours watching SpaceX's Starship prototype tests, I had an epiphany. My problem wasn't rocket science itself, it was communication. I understood the concepts, the physics, the engineering challenges of spaceflight. What I couldn't do was make other people understand why it mattered. On a whim, I set up my laptop on a makeshift stand of boat maintenance manuals and hit record. For 20 minutes straight, I talked about rocket propulsion systems, explaining in simple terms how they worked and why different rockets use different fuels. I used everyday analogies, comparing liquid oxygen and kerosene to a car's air intake and gasoline, describing rocket staging like dropping empty luggage as you climb a mountain. I uploaded to YouTube with the title "Rocket Science Isn't Rocket Science" under the channel name Backyard Booster, a self-deprecating nod to my failed experiment. I had zero expectations. It was just something to do besides stare at the ceiling of my workshop home. The next morning, it had 32 views. Not exactly viral, but not zero either. The comments were what really caught my attention. Finally, someone explaining this without making me feel stupid. "Dude, where have you been all my life? I've been trying to understand Delta V for ages." That feedback was like rocket fuel for my motivation. I immediately started planning more videos. I kept them simple. No fancy graphics or professional editing. Just me talking with occasional diagrams drawn on paper. Sometimes I'd use things around the workshop as props. A video explaining Tsiolkovsky's rocket equation using boat parts got surprisingly good engagement. By the end of my first month as a workshop dweller, Backyard Booster had over 5,000 subscribers. Not enough to make real money, but enough to give me a sense of purpose beyond just surviving. I was building something. Maybe not an actual rocket, but a community of people who share my fascination with space. As my little channel grew, so did my confidence. I started reaching out to actual aerospace professionals for interviews. Most ignored me, but few engineers from smaller companies agreed to Zoom calls. Each one added credibility to my channel and taught me something new. Around this time, Carlos started taking more interest in my YouTube project. He was studying mechanical engineering at the community college and found my explanations helped with some of his classes. He even appeared in a few videos, usually as a skeptical questioner who made me break down concepts even further. You know what would be cool? He said one evening as we ate takeout burritos on the hood of his car. If we actually built something together. Nothing crazy or dangerous. He added quickly, seeing my expression, but something to demonstrate the principles you're talking about. That conversation led to our first collaboration, a small compressed air rocket made from PVC pipe that we launched with proper safety measures and permits at the beach. The video of our test reached 50,000 views in a week, more than tripling my subscriber count. As summer approached, two important things happened. First, the YouTube algorithm finally noticed me, and my videos started appearing in recommendations. My subscriber count jumped from thousands to tens of thousands, and for the first time, ad revenue actually covered my basic expenses. Second, I stumbled across NASA's Small Business Innovation Research, SBIR, program while researching for a video. SBIR provides grants to small businesses developing technologies that could benefit NASA's missions. The minimum requirements were having a registered business with fewer than 500 employees and a proposal for innovative research. We're not a business, Carlos pointed out when I excitedly showed him the program. We're just two dudes making YouTube videos in a storage shed. But the idea wouldn't leave my mind. The application deadline was 3 months away. Plenty of time to figure something out. Plus, Carlos's family business could technically qualify. We just needed to convince his dad to let us submit under the Mendez Marine name. What we really needed was an idea innovative enough to catch NASA's attention, but practical enough to actually develop with our limited resources. The answer came from an unexpected source. For a video about SpaceX's Raptor engine, I'd been researching manufacturing techniques. One article mentioned the challenges of traditional rocket engine fabrication, the complex cooling channels, the multiple welds and joints, the potential failure points. Another article, completely unrelated, discussed advances in 3D printing with high-strength composites. The connection hit me like a lightning bolt. What if we design a rocket engine with significantly fewer parts by 3D printing components that would traditionally require assembly? The material science was already advancing rapidly. We just needed to apply it in a new way. When I pitched the idea to Carlos, I expected skepticism. Instead, his eyes lit up. That's actually not insane, he said slowly. We'd need to design something that takes advantage of 3D printing strengths while avoiding its limitations. Complex internal structures printed as a single piece. Exactly, I practically shouted. And with the right composite materials, we might even get better thermal properties than traditional metal engines. For the next 6 weeks, we worked obsessively on our proposal. By day, we still maintained our regular routines. Me helping in the shop and making videos, Carlos attending classes and working for his dad. But our nights were consumed by research, design work, and endless revisions of our application. Mr. Mendez was initially reluctant to let us use the business name, but eventually agreed after Carlos explained how even getting past the first review stage could open doors for all of us. We submitted our proposal for a 3D printed composite propulsion system, with exactly 2 hours to spare before the deadline. Then came the waiting. NASA's review process was notoriously thorough, with multiple stages of evaluation. The odds of 2 teenagers, well, Carlos was 19, I was still 17, getting funded were astronomically low. We tried to forget about it and focus on our growing YouTube channel, which had now crossed 100,000 subscribers and was generating enough revenue to let me upgrade from my futon to an actual bed and even save a little each month. 3 months after submitting, I was editing a video when my phone buzzed with an email notification. I almost ignored it, deep in concentration on my work. When I finally glanced at it, my heart nearly stopped. Dear applicant, we are pleased to inform you that your SBIR Phase 1 proposal has been selected for funding. I read the email 3 times, convinced it was a mistake or a cruel prank. But there it was. NASA had awarded us $125,000 to develop a proof of concept for our 3D printed engine design. When Carlos arrived after his classes, I wordlessly handed him my phone. He read the email, looked at me, read it again, and then let out a whoop so loud it echoed through the entire workshop complex. "We're NASA contractors," he shouted, pulling me into a bear hug that nearly crushed my ribs. "Do you realize what this means? We're actually going to build a real rocket engine with actual funding." The reality was just starting to sink in. Somehow, in the span of 4 months, I had gone from being kicked out of my house for a failed backyard rocket to receiving NASA funding for an innovative propulsion design. Life had taken the most unexpected trajectory, not the smooth curve I calculated, but something far more interesting. As Carlos called his parents to share the news, I stepped outside into the warm evening air. The same stars I'd always dreamed of reaching now seemed just a little bit closer. And somewhere up there, I like to think those NASA satellites were beaming down data to help guide my path forward, a path that had just taken the most extraordinary turn. The morning after receiving the NASA email, I woke up wondering if I dreamed the whole thing. The reality of having actual funding, $125,000 worth of validation, took days to sink in. Carlos and I spent the first week just figuring out how to set up a proper business account and understanding the paperwork requirements. Who knew that getting money from the government would involve more documentation than launching a rocket? Mr. Mendez was surprisingly helpful, connecting us with his accountant and helping us navigate the administrative side. He even cleared out the back corner of the marine repair property so we could set up a more proper workspace. The old storage shed had served its purpose, but developing NASA-funded technology while sleeping next to spare boat propellers no longer seemed appropriate. "Just don't blow up my business," was his only condition, delivered with a wink that told me he was at least a little proud of what his son and I had accomplished. The first thing we bought was a 3D printer, not one of those plastic desktop models, but a professional metal powder sintering machine that could handle the high-performance materials we needed. It cost nearly a third of our grant money, but without it, our entire concept was just theory. The day it arrived was like Christmas morning for 2 engineering geeks. We spent hours just watching it run calibration tests and printing simple shapes. Our challenge was clear: design a rocket engine with fewer parts, less weight, and comparable performance to traditionally manufactured models. The key advantage of 3D printing wasn't just simplifying assembly. It was enabling geometries that would be impossible to create any other way, like internal cooling channels with complex curves that follow the precise heat distribution patterns. I documented everything for the Backyard Booster channel, being careful not to reveal proprietary details, but sharing enough of the journey to keep my growing audience engaged. The subscriber count had passed 200,000, and the comments section had evolved from casual viewers to include serious engineering enthusiasts and industry professionals. One video about our material selection process generated an unexpected comment that changed our trajectory completely. "You should consider a nickel-chromium superalloy with fine copper distribution. We've tested similar composites at JPL for high-temp applications. Happy to discuss offline." The comment came from username AstroPropGuy83. After some cautious back-and-forth messaging, we discovered he was Dr. Alan Merritt, an actual propulsion engineer at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and he was offering to help us. Within weeks, our YouTube comment section had transformed into an informal technical advisory board. Several engineers from various aerospace companies would chime in on our videos, offering suggestions, pointing out potential issues, and sometimes debating each other about the best approach to our challenges. Carlos joked that we had somehow created the world's first crowdsourced rocket engine design team. Fortune 500 companies pay millions for this kind of consulting, he said one evening as we reviewed comments, and we're getting it for the price of reading YouTube comments. Not all advice was useful. Plenty of armchair engineers had strong opinions based on limited knowledge, but we developed a knack for distinguishing signal from noise. The professionals usually identified themselves privately, and their expertise was evident in the specificity of their recommendations. 3 months into our NASA funding, we had progressed from design to our first printed components. The combustion chamber, normally made from multiple machine parts welded together, emerged from our printer as a single integrated piece with cooling channels already built in. It was smaller than a coffee can but represented thousands of hours of design work and simulation. I held it up to the camera during a live stream, and the chat exploded with excitement. One viewer wrote, "I can't believe I'm watching rocket history happening from some dude's workshop." That comment hit me hard. Not because it was disrespectful, but because it captured exactly how surreal this journey felt. By month 4, we had a complete engine assembly ready for initial testing. This presented a new challenge. Where exactly does one test a rocket engine? Our workshop was out of question, and even if Mr. Mendez was supportive, firing a rocket engine in an industrial area seemed like a quick way to lose our business license and get a personal visit from the fire marshal. Dr. Merritt suggested we reach out to a testing facility in New Mexico that sometimes worked with small aerospace startups. When I mentioned our NASA grant, doors opened surprisingly quickly. For a reasonable fee, we could use their smallest test stand for a series of short-duration firings. The trip to New Mexico was the furthest I'd ever been from home. Carlos drove his pickup truck with our precious engine securely packed in the back, surrounded by tools and diagnostic equipment. We took turns driving the 16 hours straight through, stopping only for gas, fast food, and bathroom breaks. The testing facility was located in a remote stretch of desert that looked like the surface of Mars to my Florida-raised eyes. Miles of nothing but scrubby vegetation and red rocks, with mountains in the distance and a sky so big it seemed artificial. The facility itself was unimpressive from the outside, a cluster of low concrete buildings with some metal structures in the distance. Inside was a different story. The control room for even their smallest test cell was equipped with multiple screens displaying real-time data, high-speed cameras, and safety systems that made me realize how amateurish our previous backyard experiments had been. The technicians were professional but skeptical when they saw us. Just a couple of kids with a homemade engine. Their attitude changed when they inspected our creation. The lead engineer spent 20 minutes examining the printed combustion chamber, asking detailed questions about our manufacturing process and cooling design. "This is actually pretty impressive," he finally admitted. "How many iterations did you go through to get to this design?" 37, Carlos and I answered simultaneously, then laughed. We'd lost count of the redesigns, simulations, and refinements that led to this moment. Setting up for the test took 2 full days. Our engine needed to be mounted to the test stand, fuel and oxidizer lines connected, sensors attached, and countless safety checks performed. I barely slept the night before a scheduled test, running through mental checklists and imagining every possible failure mode. Test day arrived with perfect desert weather, clear blue skies, and minimal wind. We were relegated to the control room, while the professionals handled the final preparations. On the monitors, I could see our small engine mounted to the massive test stand, looking like a toy compared to hardware they usually tested. The countdown procedure was formalized in a way that made my backyard rocket launches seem like child's play. Each system was verified verbally, each valve position confirmed, each sensor reading checked against expected values. T-10, 9, 8. The test director's voice was calm and methodical. For a moment, I flashed back to my failed launch at home, the one that had set this entire journey in motion. How different things were now. Professional facility, engineered safety systems, and most importantly, an engine designed with actual science rather than forum speculation. 3, 2, 1, ignition. On the video feed, a bright jet of flame erupted from our engine. The sound came through the speakers a moment later, a sustained roar that made the hair on my arms stand up. The engine was firing. The test was set for a 10-second duration for this first run, and I counted every second in my head. The data scrolled across the screens. Chamber pressure, temperatures, thrust values, all within the parameters we predicted. No anomalies, no warning lights, just a perfectly functioning rocket engine doing exactly what it was designed to do. When shutdown came at T plus 10 seconds, the control room erupted in applause. The lead technician turned to us with new respect in his eyes. That's one of the cleanest first fires I've ever seen for a new design. Usually, there's at least some adjustment needed. We ran 4 more tests that day, gradually increasing the duration. The final test was a full 30-second burn that ended with all systems still nominal. Our 3D printed engine had performed flawlessly. That night, Carlos and I celebrated with the best steaks the small New Mexico town could offer. Over dinner, we uploaded a short clip of the test to the Backyard Booster channel. By the time we finished eating, it had already racked up 50,000 views and was climbing fast. The comments ranged from technical analysis to pure enthusiasm. That thrust chamber stability is incredible. Did you really design and build this yourselves? NASA needs to hire these guys ASAP. One comment, however, stood out from the rest. It was from a verified account belonging to NASA's SBIR program office. Congratulations on a successful test. Please contact our office to discuss Phase 2 opportunities and an invitation to the Johnson Space Center for a technical presentation. Carlos and I stared at the comment, then at each other. Phase 2 funding could mean up to $750,000 for further development. And a presentation at Johnson Space Center? That was the heart of NASA's human spaceflight program, where astronauts trained and missions were planned. The YouTube notification chime kept sounding as more comments poured in, but we barely noticed. Something much bigger than social media validation was happening. Our little project, born from a backyard failure and nurtured in a boat repair shop, had caught the attention of the agency that put humans on the moon. The trip back to Florida was a blur of excited conversation and future planning. We'd need to prepare a technical presentation, gather all our test data, and figure out what the next development phase would look like. When we finally pulled into Mendez Marine parking lot, exhausted but exhilarated, Carlos's entire family was waiting. Someone had printed a banner reading, NASA's newest rocket scientist, and hung across the workshop door. Mr. Mendez embraced us both, looking genuinely proud. "My son, the rocket man," he said to Carlos, then turned to me. "And you? I think it's time we moved you out of that shed and into a real apartment. NASA contractors shouldn't be sleeping next to boat parts." That night, as I packed up my few belongings from the workshop that had been my home for the past 6 months, I found myself thinking about my parents. They didn't even know about the NASA grant or the successful test. Our last conversation had been a brief, awkward phone call on my birthday, with Mom doing most of the talking and Dad silent in the background. I decided it was time to reach out again, not to gloat or prove them wrong, but because I wanted to share this journey with them. Tomorrow I would call home. But tonight, I allowed myself to simply enjoy the moment and the incredible path that lay ahead. 2 weeks later, as I boarded a plane to Houston with our engine prototype carefully packed in a custom case, I couldn't help but reflect on the absurdity of my situation. Less than a year ago, I was a high school kid who got kicked out for a failed rock experiment. Now I was flying to NASA's Johnson Space Center with an invitation from the director of their Advanced Propulsion Division. Life's trajectory, it turned out, was even harder to calculate than rocket trajectories. And for once, I was perfectly fine with that uncertainty. Walking into the Johnson Space Center with our prototype engine cradled in my arms felt like entering a cathedral. The history contained within these walls, from Apollo to the Space Shuttle to the International Space Station, was almost overwhelming. Here was where they planned missions that changed humanity forever, and somehow I'd been invited inside. Our presentation to the NASA propulsion team went better than I could have imagined. What was scheduled as a 1-hour technical briefing stretched into 3 hours of detailed discussion, with senior engineers crowding around our engine, examining the 3D printed cooling channels, and asking questions about our manufacturing process. Dr. Eleanor Reeves, the Advanced Propulsion Division Chief, seemed particularly impressed. The integration of these components as a single printed unit solves several reliability issues we've been grappling with for small-sat launchers, she noted, turning our prototype in her hands. And the weight reduction is significant. At the end of our visit, Dr. Reeves didn't just offer us Phase 2 funding. She fast-tracked our application. "We'd like to integrate your engine design into our CubeSat propulsion testbed," she explained. "The timeline is aggressive, but if you can deliver flight-ready units in 6 months, there's an orbital mission opportunity." Carlos and I walked out of NASA that day with a $750,000 contract and something even more valuable, legitimacy. We weren't just YouTube hobbyists anymore. We were NASA contractors with flight assignment. The flight back to Florida was spent frantically planning our next steps. We need to expand beyond Mr. Mendez's workshop, hire additional help, scale up our manufacturing capabilities, and formalize our company structure. Momentum shifted into overdrive after that. Carlos dropped out of community college to work full-time on our startup, which we named Nexus Propulsion. His engineering credits would have to wait. This opportunity wouldn't. I leased a small industrial space near Cape Canaveral, close to the action, but far enough from tourist areas to keep our rent reasonable. Within weeks, we'd moved our equipment from a Mendez Marine shop to our new facility, complete with proper safety systems and room to grow. Our YouTube following exploded after we shared NASA-approved highlights from our Johnson Space Center visit. The Backyard Booster channel passed 1 million subscribers, and the ad revenue alone was enough to cover my modest living expenses, while every cent of investment went back into the business. Then came a call that changed everything again. A journalist from TechCrunch had seen our videos and wanted to do a feature on the teenage rocket scientists revolutionizing small satellite propulsion. The article published 3 days later with a headline, "From Backyard Blast and NASA Contract, The Rocket Revolution in a Boat Repair Shop." The story went viral. Suddenly, my face was appearing on tech news sites, science publications, and even a brief segment on CNN. Popular Mechanics put our engine on their digital cover with the title "The Future of Space," printed in 3D. My phone wouldn't stop ringing with interview requests, and our company email was flooded with messages from potential investors. Venture capitalists who had never given us the time of day were now scrambling to get in on what they saw as the next big aerospace breakthrough. 6 months after our NASA presentation, Nexus Propulsion was no longer just Carlos and me tinkering in a workshop. We had 11 employees, including 3 experienced aerospace engineers who took pay cuts to join our team, a proper manufacturing facility, and a valuation of $15 million after our first funding round. We delivered 8 flight-ready engines to NASA on schedule, watched nervously as they underwent acceptance testing, and celebrated when all 8 passed. Our design would fly on an experimental CubeSat deployment mission the following spring. Private companies came calling next. Rocket Lab wanted to evaluate our engine for their Electron rocket's upper stage. Firefly Aerospace discussed incorporating our technology into their orbital transfer vehicles. Even Blue Origin sent representatives to tour our facility and discuss potential applications. One Tuesday morning, as I was reviewing test data from our latest engine variant, our receptionist messaged me. "There are 2 men here to see you. They don't have an appointment, but they say they're family." I knew immediately who it was. Part of me had been expecting this visit ever since our story hit the mainstream news. Still, seeing my father and older brother standing awkwardly in our company lobby was surreal. Dad looked older, more weathered than I remember from just 18 months earlier. My brother Mark had the same confident posture, but seemed uncomfortable in this environment. "Let's talk in my office," I said, leading them through our facility. I watched their eyes widen as we passed the manufacturing floor, where 3 3D printers were simultaneously building engine components, then through the engineering room, where our team was running simulations on large monitors. My office wasn't large or fancy. I'd put our money into equipment, not decorations, but it had a glass wall overlooking the test preparation area where technicians were assembling our newest prototype. Dad stared through the glass for a long moment before finally speaking. "Your mother keeps all your news articles in a scrapbook," he said, his voice rougher than I remembered. "The fish farm isn't doing so well. Red tide hit us hard last season, and the banks aren't as understanding as they used to be." Mark was more direct. "We're proud of you, little brother. You're all over the news. Even Old Man Jenkins at the bait shop has your Popular Mechanics cover pinned up." I nodded, waiting for them to get to the point. They hadn't driven all this way just to admire my facility. "The thing is," Dad continued, looking at the floor instead of me, "we've been thinking maybe your rocket ideas weren't so crazy after all. You've proven yourself, son, made something impressive here." He gestured around at the office. "We always knew you were smart, just didn't think this rocket business had a future." He cleared his throat, uncomfortable with what came next. "The farm's underwater Financially, I mean, banks threatening foreclosure. We were hoping, well, since you're doing so well now. The implication hung in the air between us. They needed money. They'd kicked me out, and now they wanted a bailout. Part of me wanted to be petty, to remind them how Dad had stood in our driveway and told me never come back, how they'd dismissed my passion as childish until it proved profitable, how I'd slept on a futon surrounded by boat parts while they enjoyed the home I wasn't welcome in. But looking at my father, proud, stubborn, and now humbled by circumstance, I couldn't muster the anger I thought I'd feel. Success had healed more wounds than I realized. I can help with the farm, I said finally, not as a gift, but as an investment. We'll structure it properly through the business. I explained my terms, enough to clear their debt with the bank, but contingent on modernizing their operations and improving their environmental practices. We don't need charity, Dad began, but Mark cut him off. It's not charity, it's business, my brother said firmly. Zach's offering us a chance most failing fish farms would kill for. After they left with preliminary paperwork to review, I sat alone in my office, watching the sunset over the test facility. Carlos found me there an hour later, still deep in thought. "So that was your dad?" he asked, dropping into the chair across from me. He looked exactly how I imagined, like a guy who'd kick out his kid for building rockets. I laughed to spite myself. "Yeah. Well, now he wants investment in his fish farm. Are you going to do it?" I nodded slowly. "I think so. Not for him, really, for Mom and for the family legacy, but mostly because I can." That night, a reporter from a local TV station called for yet another interview about our rags to rockets story. She asked the question everyone seemed to find most fascinating. How does it feel to go from being kicked out of your home to becoming a millionaire aerospace entrepreneur in less than 2 years? I thought about my father standing uncomfortably in my office and gave her an answer I hadn't planned. I had to build my own rocket to reach heights where they'd never seen me before. But I don't hold grudges. I've learned that sometimes to truly fly, you need to break away from what's holding you down. That doesn't mean you can't circle back later, just that you have to find your own trajectory first. The quote made headlines the next day. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "We always loved you. Your father just didn't understand your path. He does now." As our engines passed their final qualification test for spaceflight, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me here. The failed backyard rocket that seemed like the end of my world had actually been the beginning. Getting kicked out had forced me to find people who believed in my vision, rather than try and convert those who didn't. Every setback, the night spent on a workshop futon, the failed prototypes, the technical challenges, had been necessary steps toward this moment. In 6 weeks, our engine would ignite in a vacuum of space, pushing a satellite into its final orbit. I realized that rocket science and life follow the same fundamental principle. Sometimes, the only way to achieve the impossible is to let go of what's comfortable and embrace the forces that propel you forward, even when they feel like they're tearing you apart. Launch days have a particular feeling, a mix of Christmas morning excitement and final exam anxiety that creates a unique cocktail of emotions in your gut. After 2 years of work, countless setbacks, and more all-nighters than I could count, our first complete rocket stood on the launch pad at the Mojave Air and Spaceport in California. It wasn't a giant by any means, just 26 feet tall, with a single-stage engine configuration optimized for suborbital testing. But it was ours, built from the ground up with our 3D printed propulsion system as its heart. We named it Workshop 1 as a nod to our humble beginnings. The launch window opened at 6 a.m., which meant our team had been on site since 3:30, running through final checks and battling pre-launch jitters with massive quantities of coffee. The desert air was crisp and cool, but I knew it would be scorching by midday. April in the Mojave doesn't stay comfortable for long. From my position in the mission control tent, I could see the VIP viewing area about a quarter mile from the launch pad. We'd never planned on having VIPs at our first launch. This was supposed to be a purely technical milestone, but as our company's profile grew, so did interest in our work. NASA officials, potential investors, and even a handful of journalists with proper credentials had been cleared to observe. And then there was my family. Mom and Dad stood awkwardly at the edge of the viewing area, looking both proud and out of place in their Sunday best. Mark had brought his wife and kids, who were bouncing with excitement. Even my little sister had flown in from college for the occasion. Our relationship was still a work in progress, but the investment in their fish farm had been a turning point. Dad had swallowed his pride and accepted my help, and in return, I begun to understand that his initial rejection had come from a place of fear for my safety rather than a lack of belief in my abilities. To minus 15 minutes and counting, our flight director announced, pulling my attention back to the task at hand. Our small mission control was nothing like NASA's Houston facility, just a cluster of folding tables with laptops and communication equipment under a reinforced tent. But the fundamentals were the same. Every system needed verification. Every sensor reading had to be within parameters, and every team member needed to be ready. Carlos sat beside me at the propulsion station, monitoring engine telemetry. He'd grown from my friend with a workshop to a legitimate aerospace engineer, having completed his degree through evening classes while helping build our company. His hands moved confidently over the keyboard as he ran final simulations. Propulsion systems nominal, he reported. Chamber pressure stable. Feed systems at operating temperature, all sensors reporting. Around the room, similar confirmations came from each station. We might have started as YouTube hobbyists, but we built a professional team that knew exactly what they were doing. Many had left cushy jobs at larger aerospace companies, drawn by the startup energy and the chance to see their work fly sooner rather than later. As the countdown continued, I found myself thinking about each step that had led to this moment. From that first explosion in my parents' backyard to sleeping in a boat repair shop, from our first NASA grant to the frantic months of developing a launch-ready system. None of it had gone according to plan, yet somehow all of it had been necessary. T-minus 5 minutes. Switching to internal power. The rocket was now running on its own batteries and systems. The umbilical cords connecting it to ground power, and data had retracted. Workshop. One was becoming its own entity, ready to leave us behind. T-minus 3 minutes. Beginning terminal countdown sequence. On the launch pad, automatic systems began the final preparations. Propellant tanks pressurized, guidance systems initialized, and the onboard computer ran through its pre-flight checklist. Our baby was all grown up and making its own decisions now. I glanced at the small monitor showing the VIP viewing area. Everyone was on their feet now, eyes locked on the distant rocket. My father had his arm around my mother's shoulders. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, I realized I had already accomplished something significant. I had made them proud. T-minus 1 minute. The atmosphere and mission control shifted from focused tension to a sort of suspended animation. All the preparations were complete. All the calculations had been run. All we could do now was watch and hope that our creation performed as designed. T-minus 30 seconds. I found myself holding my breath. 2 years of work, millions in investment, and countless hours of engineering all came down to the next few minutes. Failure wouldn't be the end. Rocket development always includes setbacks, but success would accelerate our trajectory in ways failure never could. T-minus 10, 9, 8. The traditional countdown seemed to slow time itself. Each number took an eternity to pronounce. 3, 2, 1, ignition. A brilliant flame erupted from the base of our rocket as the 3D printed engine roared to life, its complex internal channels precisely controlling the flow of propellants. For a heart-stopping moment, the rocket seemed to hesitate, as if gathering its strength. "Come on," Carlos whispered beside me. "Come on, baby, fly." Then, with a thunderous roar that we could hear even through our headsets, workshop, one began to rise. Slowly at first, then with increasing speed, it climbed into the bright California sky, riding atop a perfect column of flame. The tracking cameras followed its ascent as the rocket accelerated, breaking through the sound barrier with a faint visual distortion in the air around it. The flight profile on our screen showed a perfect match with our simulations. Every parameter exactly where it should be. Max Q achieved in nominal, called out our aerodynamics lead, referring to the moment of maximum aerodynamic pressure on the vehicle. Vehicle is supersonic and stable. The hardest part was behind us. If the rocket could survive the stresses of max Q, the rest of the flight should go smoothly. For 6 glorious minutes, Workshop 1 continued its ascent, eventually cutting off its engine at precisely the planned moment, coasting to an apogee of 82 miles, technically crossing the Kármán line and reaching space. Our tracking system showed it deploying its small test payload, a cube of scientific instruments, before beginning its planned descent. The parachute recovery system deployed exactly on cue, bringing our rocket's main stage floating gently back to Earth about 20 miles downrange in the designated recovery zone. The entire flight had gone exactly according to plan. Mission Control erupted in cheers, high fives, and more than a few tears. Carlos grabbed me in a bear hug that nearly crushed my ribs, both of us laughing and shouting incoherently. Our team had done the impossible, taking a concept from a boat repair shop all the way to space in just 2 years. The celebration at the viewing area was just as enthusiastic. Through our cameras, I could see investors shaking hands, journalists speaking rapidly into their microphones, and NASA officials nodding with approval. My family was jumping up and down, hugging each other as if they'd built the rocket themselves. After completing the immediate post-flight procedures, our team headed out to meet the observers. I found myself surrounded by congratulations, questions, and requests for interviews, but I made a beeline for my family first. Mom wrapped me in a hug that felt like coming home. "I always knew you'd reach the stars," she whispered, her voice catching. Dad stood behind her, struggling to maintain his composure. When I extended my hand to him, he ignored it and pulled me into an embrace instead. "You did it, son," he said simply. "You really did it." The weeks after the launch were a whirlwind. Our success made headlines across the tech and science world, with headlines like "The Workshop Rocket Reaches Space" and "DIY Aerospace. From Garage to Orbit." Investment offers poured in, with our company valuation soaring past $100 million. NASA fast-tracked a contract for a series of our engines to be used on their lunar payload delivery systems. SpaceX reached out about potential collaboration on their Mars transportation architecture. Universities requested our participation in their aerospace programs. Our team expanded rapidly, moving from our modest facility to a proper aerospace campus with multiple buildings and test stands. The YouTube channel that had started it all grew to over 5 million subscribers, with each new video documenting our journey and explaining the science behind our work. 6 months after our successful launch, we broke ground on a new manufacturing facility near Kennedy Space Center. The governor attended the ceremony, along with representatives from NASA and various aerospace companies. I found myself standing at a podium, looking out at hundreds of faces, including many young people who reminded me of myself not so long ago. People often ask me what the secret was to our success. I began. They want to know if it was the innovative technology, the NASA grants, or just good timing. But the real answer is much simpler. It was about believing in an idea enough to pursue it even when everyone else thinks you're crazy. I gestured toward our company's newest rocket prototype, displayed prominently beside the stage. This rocket isn't just a machine, it's a philosophy. It says that barriers are meant to be broken, that conventional wisdom should be questioned, and that sometimes getting kicked out of your comfort zone is the best thing that can happen to you. Looking out at the crowd, I spotted a group of high school students wearing matching science club t-shirts. Their eager expressions reminded me so much of my younger self that it almost hurt. To the young dreamers out there, the ones building robots in their bedrooms or coding apps at their kitchen tables or, yes, launching rockets in their backyards, I want you to know something. America was built by people who refused to accept limitations. From a Wright Brothers bike shop to the garages of Silicon Valley to our little boat repair workshop, innovation doesn't require permission or pedigree. I paused, thinking of my own journey. What it requires is persistence. There will be explosions, both literal and metaphorical. There will be nights when you sleep on a futon surrounded by spare parts. There will be people who tell you to get a real job or follow a safer path. Listen politely, then get back to work on your impossible dream. 3 years after our groundbreaking, Nexus Propulsion had become one of the leading private aerospace companies in America. Our engines powered satellites, research payloads, and even a lunar lander. Our manufacturing techniques had revolutionized not just rocketry, but were being adapted for applications in medical devices, automotive components, and energy systems. Carlos and I still maintained our original workshop, one rocket in a display case in our headquarters lobby. Beside it stood the charred remains of my first backyard rocket, the one that had exploded and set this entire journey in motion. Together, they told a story of failure and success, of persistence and innovation. On the 5th anniversary of our company's founding, I took a rare day off and drove out to my parents' fish farm. Dad had used our investment wisely, modernizing the operation and making it sustainable both environmentally and financially. As we sat on the dock watching the sunset, he asked me a question that caught me off guard. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if your rocket hadn't blown up that day? If I hadn't lost my temper and kicked you out? I thought about it carefully before answering. I think about it sometimes. But you know what? That explosion was the best thing that ever happened to me. Not because it was a good rocket. It was terrible engineering, honestly, but because it forced me onto a path I might never have found otherwise. I gazed up at the darkening sky, where the first stars were becoming visible. Americans have always had this idea that you can reinvent yourself, that failure is just a step on the path to success. It sounds like a cliche until you live it. Every setback forced me to find a new approach. Every closed door made me look for an open window. That's not just rocket science, that's life. Dad nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. Your grandfather used to say something similar about farming. Said you haven't really learned to grow things until you watched the whole season's crop fail and had to start over. As night fell over the fish farm where I'd grown up, I reflected on the strange orbital mechanics of life, how a catastrophic failure had launched me into a trajectory I could never have calculated, carrying me further than I'd ever dreamed possible. And like any good rocket scientist, I was already planning the next mission.